Welcome to participants from around the world to this webinar on heritage and sustainability, and a warm welcome to our esteemed panellists. We are grateful that they have accepted our invitation. With the upcoming 50th anniversary of the World Heritage Convention and the 20th anniversary of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention, the UNESCO Chair in International Law and Cultural Heritage, with my partners from the 4 Universities Consortium on Cultural Heritage Law, Professor Wong of Rennes, Professor Bory of Toulouse, and Professor Vigneron of Kent Law Schools, are hosting a series of events on the theme of heritage and sustainability. The recording of this webinar and information about the program will be available on the UNESCO Chair website, and links will also be provided to participants after this event. In the lead up to the formulation and adoption of the Sustainability Development Goals by the General Assembly in 2015, there had been a concerted push to include culture and cultural heritage. The final text of the Sustainable Development Goals was a disappointment for many on this front, however. As we enter the final decade of the SDGs, there has been a renewed focus on the role of culture and cultural heritage in sustainable development. Starting in 2017, the General Assembly has adopted a series of resolutions on culture and sustainable development. In September this year, Mexico will host the UNESCO World Conference on Cultural Policies and Sustainable Development, known as Mondicult 2022. 40 years after it had hosted the first such conference in 1982. This is a reminder that the international community has recognised the symbiosis between culture and sustainability for decades. This webinar on cultural heritage and sustainability is an opportunity to review and reflect upon the work of UNESCO through the operation of its culture conventions and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, with a focus on the Asia-Pacific region. Our region, which is a home to so many small island states and some of the world's largest cities, is addressing the challenges related to sustainability and sustainable development on multiple fronts. The preparatory documents of Mondicult 2022 emphasise the call to action on international cooperation by the UN Secretary-General. As the role of international organisations is being put under a spotlight, our discussion also enables us to think about UNESCO's culture mandate in furthering universal respect for justice, for the rule of law, and for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Drawing on their work and contribution over decades, from the local to the global levels, our 3 panellists will provide important insights on the relationship between cultural heritage and sustainable development, and the role and indeed the future of international cooperation. The panellists will be presenting for 10 to 15 minutes. This will enable us a period of Q&A at the end of the final panellists' presentation. Attendees are asked to pop their questions that they may have for the panellists in the Q&A function. These will then be put to the panellists at the end of the last presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made publicly available after this event. Now let me introduce our first speaker. Her Excellency Judge Hilary Charlesworth is a judge of the International Court of Justice and was previously juge ad hoc of the court. She is a member of the Institut Droit International, and before joining the court, she was Harrison Moore Professor of Law and Melbourne Laureate Professor at Melbourne Law School and Distinguished Professor at the ANU. She is on the Executive Council of the Asian and American Societies of International Law and is past President of the Australian and New Zealand Society of International Law. Judge Charlesworth has received numerous international awards in recognition of her groundbreaking research in the fields of human rights and international humanitarian law, the structure of the international legal system and peace building, and international legal theory, particularly feminist approaches, and the art of international law, the latter being the subject of her Hague Academy General course in 2019. Her thoughtful, daring and humane contributions on and to the role of international law in relations between people from the global to the personal gives us the courage to confront the challenges raised by our themes today. Welcome, Judge Charlesworth. The floor is yours.
Many thanks, Anna, for that very kind introduction, and it's a delight to be with you, at least in spirit, in Sydney this evening, but I'm speaking to you from The Hague. And very belatedly, I'd like to publicly congratulate Anna on her appointment to the UNESCO chair, a really significant development, not only for Anna personally, but for Australia, and I think for international lawyers generally. And I'm really delighted to be part of this webinar. But I do have to admit straight away that I do feel as an interloper, as I'm by no means an expert in cultural heritage. But what I thought I could do perhaps as an international lawyer is to offer an overview of the international legal dimensions of the concept of sustainability, particularly in its guise as sustainable development, as a frame for the discussion. So the idea of sustainable development brings together two very appealing notions. On the one hand, protection of the environment, and on the other, the promotion of economic and social development. So the idea is that this term, sustainable development, is some sort of bridge between, on the one hand, what's been called the needs and excesses of humanity, on the one hand, and the natural environment on which it relies on the other. In that sense, and to borrow the words of Lucas Lesinski, our Australian-Brazilian colleague, the global endorsement of this idea rests on a claim, and these are Lucas's words: environmental conservation does not necessarily constrain development, or that development necessarily means pollution of environmental degradation. So attempts to sort of bring together these two areas to reconcile environmental protection and the right to development were evident early in 1972 in the final texts from the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, a UN conference. But it wasn't really until, over a decade later, that the idea of sustainable development was more fully articulated. And this was in the 1987 report of the Brundtland Commission on Environment and Development, Our Common Future. Now that important report recognised that economic growth could lead to environmental harm, but also it made the claim, and these are its words, that poverty itself pollutes the environment, creating environmental stress in a different way. Now, many of you, I suspect, listening may be familiar with the Brundtland Commission's definition of sustainable development because it's quoted time and time again, and it's included in a number of the UN resolutions that Anna has already referenced. And here is the definition. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So counterposing there the needs of different generations. Well, one assessment of that definition by Duncan French is that, and these are his words, it recognised the real needs of developing countries, that was one of the hallmarks of the Brundtland Commission, without apparently requiring unpalatable solutions from developed countries. The idea that this was a definition that tried to give something to all parts of the globe. Well, there have been many endorsements of the concept of sustainable development since then, including in Agenda 21, adopted at the 1992 Rio Conference on Environment Development. And of course, the language has been adopted through and through the Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the General Assembly in 2015 that Anna has already referred to. So we can see that the language of sustainable development is pretty widely used globally, but there remain intense debates about what it means exactly and how it can be implemented. In fact, some have suggested that the value of the term sustainable development or sustainability derives precisely from its vagueness. But the question that I want to address briefly is, whatever all this debate, does the idea of sustainability, sustainable development have any legal ramifications? Certainly the concept of sustainable development spans many legal fields, including environmental, economic, human rights, and of course, its cultural heritage. So we see the term, what's very striking from a lawyer's perspective is that the term sustainable development is included in many treaties, including, of course, heritage treaties, but it has remained quite elusive and undefined. The International Court of Justice, my current home, endorsed the concept in general terms, and this is often celebrated in the literature. In a 1997 case between Hungary and Slovakia, this was a case concerning the Gabčíkovo-Nový Maroš electric dam project on the Danube River. And the court there simply noted the need to recognise economic development with protection of the environment. And the court made quite a general statement calling on both those countries to consider the effect of the Gabčíkovo power plant on the environment. One of the judges on that court, the Australian Sri Lankan judge, Judge Christy Veeramantri, went further than the majority in that case. And he suggested in a separate opinion that sustainable development actually had status as a principle of customary international law. But certainly there are some international lawyers, notably the eminent environmental lawyer Philippe Sands, who would agree with Judge Veeramantri, but I think it's fair to say that the claim remains controversial. Indeed, some international lawyers, and I'm thinking here of Professor Vaughan Lowe in particular, have questioned whether it's possible to endow the concept of sustainable development with specific legal content at all. He's argued that its most valuable role is as what he's called an interstitial concept, whose role is actually filling gaps, whose role is to manage overlaps or conflicts between norms of international law in a coherent way. So I think we can say somewhere between the enthusiastic endorsement of sustainability as a principle of customary international law and perhaps the sense that it's only a gap filler. Some international lawyers have argued that sustainable development does have legal content. So Duncan French, for example, has argued that the concept rests on the implementation of 4 different principles. First of all, integration of environmental protection into the development decision-making process. Secondly, sustainable use of natural resources. Thirdly, the equitable meeting of the development needs of both present and future generations. And finally, the duty to cooperate at a global level. So on that analysis, the idea of sustainable development links rules and principles that are often compartmentalized, that often remain separate. And so, and this is of course of direct relevance to cultural heritage law, all those principles, those 4 principles I've just flagged, while they're of varying legal status, when you put them together, these principles can have a significant regulatory effect. They provide, for example, important parameters for negotiation, interpretation, and implementation of other international obligations, such as cultural heritage ones. So in that sense, it's been said that sustainable development, and I'm quoting Behrling here in saying that it can be a catalyst in the process of further developing international law. So as Anna has flagged, UNESCO's adoption of a policy on World Heritage and Sustainable Development in 2015 was, of course, a really important milestone, emphasising the principles of human rights, equality, and long-term sustainability. But in the context of heritage protection, we should be aware that sustainable development, that idea whose complexity I've just given you a taste of, can play a number of conflicting roles. As Bill Logan and Peter Larson have noted, these quoting from them, a sustainable development can be a need, a threat, a solution, or even an objective of heritage. So it can come into play in a great variety of ways. So certainly the goal of sustainable development can be consistent with the conservation of cultural heritage, and it's not difficult to think of examples of that. But I think we should also be aware that the intertwining of the notions of heritage and sustainability doesn't always have progressive outcomes. The linkage can add a new tension into the already complex idea of sustainable development and can raise questions of justice. So Lucas Lisinski has pointed out that the concepts of both sustainability and heritage share the aspiration, and these are his words, of preserving a romanticized, untainted version of the past when man lived in harmony with nature and culture flourished. He's pointed out that this can effectively, and again I quote, frees heritage and the environment to a certain moment in time, reinforcing a romanticized ideal of existence, one that thinks of traditional culture as necessarily connected to nature. End of quote. So those are important caveats to be aware of when we enter this field. I think one overarching concern, again, scholars such as Lucas Leśniczki have pointed this out, is the focus of the cultural heritage field on listing particular areas, monuments, cultures, and communities, and to be aware of the unintended consequence that non-listed entities then can be considered fair game for economic exploitation. So in this vein, Leśniczki has analysed what he's called a term beloved of international lawyers, the dark sides of concepts. This is a concept used by an American colleague too, Professor David Kennedy. So Leśniczki has in a very interesting way explored the dark sides of sustainable development in the heritage field, observing that the concept has often been deployed to emphasise economic growth and in a sense then to bring a capitalist logic to heritage. And yet he's also recognised, as has many other scholars, that there can often be friction between the goal of conservation of nature, supported typically by Western donors, and local populations' interests in economic development. So the tensions cut in many different directions. So it's important, I think, to recognise that there are tensions inherent in the marriage, the linkage of heritage protection and sustainability. This, of course, can be exacerbated by the international decision-making processes that tend to marginalise the voices of peoples most affected by heritage decisions who are at the local level. So from an international human rights perspective, the challenge is to ensure the meaningful participation of local actors when heritage protection and management are considered at the international level. This will allow, and again, I quote from Lucas Leśniczki, goals and expectations from both the global and the local to be constantly readjusted and negotiated. So the recognition that decisions won't go in one direction and that keeping sustainability in harmony with cultural heritage protection involves a constant process of dialogue and negotiation. So to conclude then, given that framework, I'm very much looking forward to hearing my fellow panelists talk about precisely this type of projects. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you very much, Judge Charlesworth, for that intervention, and it sets us up nicely for our other panellists, and I'm hoping that our colleague from Suva is able to come through. We're just waiting for her to come through, but now I will, and again, thank you, Judge Charlesworth. It's a nice segue into our next panellist, though, Dr. He from the Beijing Cultural Heritage Protection Centre. So welcome, Dr. He. He is a graduate of the East China University of Political Science and Law of Shanghai, where his interest in cultural heritage, particularly the regulation of trade in cultural objects, began. He taught at the China University of Political Science and Law, where he fostered his proactive grassroots approach to cultural heritage conservation. In 1998, he started a small voluntary group called Cultural Heritage Watch, which was later registered as the Beijing Cultural Heritage Protection Centre in 2003. So almost 20 years in existence. He has contributed to public participation in cultural heritage protection in China and internationally through the work of the centre. His commitment to the promotion of the rule of law in cultural heritage protection is long-standing and unwavering, recognition of which has led to receipt of numerous awards, including the Society of American Archaeology's Outstanding Public Service Award. Now, I'll have to ask our participants to bear with me. We have had some technical problems with the simultaneous translation, so we will endeavour to do the simultaneous translation. But if that does not work, then we will have to have translation done side by side. So I will try and do the simultaneous translation. So Dr. He, I will invite you to start, and if the simultaneous translation does not work, it may be that we will need to go to option B, which is your introduction in Mandarin, and then my colleague, Professor Tian, will do the English translation afterwards. Dr. Khair.
好，大家好，我的发言由悉尼科技大学法学院的田教授帮助做翻译。让田教授。
Talk will be translated by Professor George Tian from UTS Law School.
感谢会议主办方的邀请。我
Thanks
想
to
利
the
用这个
conference organizer for the invitation.
遗产保护需要
I
得到
want to
公
take this
平、
opportunity to stress the cultural heritage protection
有效的规
need
范
to be the more powerful and efficiently regulated and guided by the principle of
在
fairness
文
and
化遗产
justice.
可持续发展专题会议上强调公平和正义有多个原因。
There's several reasons why fairness and justice should be emphasized at the conference on cultural heritage and
首先，文
sustainable
化遗产
development.
保护与利益诉求、文化权利、社会进步关系非常密切。
First,
所谓
the
的
cultural
文化遗产
heritage protection is closely related to the interest demands, cultural rights, and social progress. The so-called cultural heritage protection must be based on principle of fairness and justice.
第二，以文化遗产保护之名挑战公平和正义原则的事例明显存在，却难以得到有力批
Secondly,
判和有效
there are
的
clear cases in which the people use the cultural heritage protection as an excuse to challenge the principle of fairness and justice. But it's not an easy task to effectively condemn and prevent those from happening.
第三，背离公平和正义原则的问题，如果不能很好解决，文化遗产保护促进人类社会发展有关。
Thirdly, unless the principle of fairness and justice are well followed, the journey of cultural heritage protection and the sustainable development of human society will not be so smooth.
在我生活的地区，有很多以文化遗产保护之名挑战公平原则的。
In the area where I live, there are many cases where the cultural heritage protection has been used as an excuse to challenge the principle of fairness.
比如一些考古学家长期不公开考古发掘品，不公布考古发掘报告，这对公众和其他学者而言是不公平的。尽管法律对
Some archaeologists are long overdue release archaeological evacuation.
考古学家
Neither
看
did
上
they
去
release their
强大的话语，
archaeological evacuation report is arguably unfair for the public and other research scholars. Also, the new law specifies a timeline for release. Those deadline hasn't been taken seriously. Those archaeologists seems to have substantial power in navigating the media discourse and make themselves look like a guardian angel and of those excavations.
再比如，政府可以将私有建筑公布为文化遗产地予以保护，而不必
One more
征得
example, government could
也不
directly declare a
当
private building as a
政府而
cultural
言，
heritage site for protection
这样的不公
without
平得到
obtaining
法律的保护
consent or paying
一些立法责
appropriate
任
compensation to the
如果
building
法律
owner in the first place.
制定过于原则，
This
有
is
些人会
unfair to the building owner, but such injustice has been tolerant by existing law. Some lawmakers even argue that including the compensation provision in current law would bring uncertainty. Some building owner may charge sky-high price if the provision are too general. By contrast, if the provision are too specific, the government may has to compensate each building owner, which may exist the government's affordability.
又比如，边缘而古老的村落往往是贫穷的、老龄化的，以及拥有文化遗产价值的。机缘巧合下，政府和企业会联合
For
选取
another
其中
example, some old village with cultural heritage value are
公
often
益研究
poor,
建
aging,
设
and located in remote area. By chance,
这样的过程
local
中，
government and
往往
enterprise
快速
may jointly
粗暴
select some village with
对
more
落实这个原则
protection
的
value,
产品的
then
能力
relocate original people in
当
those
然，不
villages.
公平是会留下祸根的。这
And
样的旅游
tourism attraction
跟
or
村
so-called
民
eco museum.
发生冲突
Such
是常态。
exploration action are
第三个
often
例子
conducted
则是夜间突
suddenly
发大
and
火，
harshly.
将重
It
建的
places
传统
Aboriginal people in very disadvantaged situation. They do not have a bargaining power. However, no one can escape from the universal law of cause and effect. injustice often incur punishment and revenge. Conflicts between the villagers and tourists in those tourism sport never stop. It even triggers extreme situations such as a night fire burning down all historical buildings.
类似的不公平长期存在，必然损害可持续发展，也必然使公众逐渐厌恶所谓的文化遗产保护。
Similar injustice will inevitably jeopardize sustainable development and may result in public negative attitude, even hatred towards cultural heritage protection.
相对而言，在全球不少地区共同存在的以文化遗产保护之名挑战正义原则的现象，对人类社会可
The
持续发展
situation
的
in which the people use heritage protection as an excuse to challenge the principle of justice can be found in many parts of the world. It would seriously jeopardize the sustainable development of human society and bring in horrifying consequences.
极端的民族主义、疯狂的民粹主义以及相伴而生的威权专制政治，它们构成了对人类正义极大的破坏。
Extreme
战
nationalism,
争他们
irrational
反除它的
populism,
土壤，人
accompanied
类为付出的努力无疑
authoritarian politics
应当
ultimately
成为
result in the great destruction of human
在
justice.
不少地区，
The
在不同
human
程度上
effort
所谓
of
的文化
defeating
遗产
them
保护，正沦为他们
eradicated
的
the
方
soil
式。
of nutritionism. Those
这
efforts
不是
themselves would unfortunately become the most crucial part of cultural heritage. Nevertheless, to various degrees, the cultural heritage protection is used as an excuse in many areas as became their accomplice and tool. This is not overstatement.
当初希特勒强力推行的艺术品收集与博物馆发展计划，看似多么宏大的文化遗产项目，却是纳粹德国给人类文明带来
We
灾
must
难的罪。
remember in the beginning,
现在
the
在
art
民族主义阵
collection
中，
and
民族主义
museum development plan, which
人专
Hitler
制这种
strongly
高大的
promoted, seemed
文
to
化
be
遗产
grand
概念，
project
人类
for the
正被
cultural
强
heritage
暴的人
protection,
用歪
but
曲，
it was a powerful tool
成为愚民教育的
driving force
核心
behind the disaster Nazi Germany
民众
brought
对
to human
对
civilization.
宗教的文化遗产，
Nowadays,
愚弄
in an era
样
where the
而那
nationalism
个
is
狂暴者
widespread,
提起他们的
populism is rising,
和
and
人
high
类这些
pressure
捏造出的文
authoritarian
化遗产，
politics is
带来
growing. The concept, the region, and the connotation of cultural heritage are being used, distorted, and trampled with by some furious people and have become the tool of educated ignorance and autocratic politics. The public is fooled and kidnapped by the fictitious and fabricated cultural heritage, and those angry people and their masters have become spokesperson and a protector of this fictional and fabricated cultural heritage.
这样的过程中，被歪曲、篡改、捏造的，除了文化遗产，还有公平原则本身。不同文化间的公平，不同社
In
区、
this
族群
process, cultural heritage and the principle of fairness
涉及到的
are
所有基本
distorted, tempered,
被改造成
and
威权政治，
fabricated. Now,
于是
justice
在文
between
化遗产
different
保护里
culture, community,
共同推进
ethnic
威权
group,
专制
and interest group, and all the fundamental issues involved in the principle of fairness have been converted, transformed into the theoretical basis of authoritarian politics. Along with so-called cultural heritage protection, they have been jointly used promote authoritarian politics.
文化遗产保护背离公平正义原则的事例和现象明显存在，根本原因可以归结为对文化遗产和公平正义的理解、遵从，既没有在
A
文
clear
化遗
case of phenomenal in which
公
cultural heritage protection
强大的力
derived
量，
from the principle of fairness and justice. Fundamental reason behind
到足够坚实的保
our
障。
cultural heritage and fairness and justice principle have not become powerful mindset of cultural heritage protection practitioner and the public. None has been solidly reinforced in the rule of law system at national and international level.
文化的要义、文化遗产的本质、文化遗产保护的使命、 公平的准绳正义
The
的方
essence
向。
of culture
所有这些
heritage,
对于
the mission of
的理
cultural heritage protection,
防
and the
一
criteria
些专家
of
和立法人
fairness
那里，
and the
要么
moral orientation of
要
justice.
么辩论无分，
All those
要么
most
有之王。
basic concepts should have been common sense for everyone. But for some expert and lawmaker, their understanding about those concepts is either blank, secretive, or false.
还有2种因素可能助长文化遗产保护背离公平正义原则：一是历史与文化领域普遍存在的傲慢和偏见；
Furthermore, two
不
other
断发酵
factors
的
may cause cultural heritage
傲
protection
慢、
to be
偏见和
diverted
历史
from the
经验
fairness
往往
and
缠绕
justice
着文
principle.
化遗产价
One
值
is
产
the
生，
pride and
以及
prejudice
甚至
that
背离
prevail in the field of history and
正义
culture.
发展
The
将
other
共
is
同
ever-growing history and
和
grievance
威权专制政
and
治的
pride,
方向。
prejudice, and historical grievance are often entangled in the cultural heritage and the interpretation of its value, making the people's understanding of them alienated and deviating from common sense. Allowing this to develop randomly in this way would eventually make a cultural heritage become a complex or tool of nationalism, populism, or authoritarian politics.
强化公平正义原则对文化遗产保护的规范指引，需要提高公众意识，完善法治。许多工
To
作要由
strengthen the
整体的
function of the fairness and the justice principle as public
正是因
norm
为意识到
and
文化遗产
guideline
所在
for the cultural heritage protection is imperative to
文化遗
promote
产保护
public awareness and improve the rule of law.
帮助社
Much
区居
work
民
needs to be complete by the local community, which they have their duty and obligation. Bear in mind the importance of enhancing awareness of fairness and the justice principle among the people where the cultural heritage sites are located. 20 years ago, when we established Beijing Cultural Heritage Protection Center, we have set our mission to help community residents to protect their cultural heritage, and we continue to work hard on this.
在这里，我想强调的是，国际间的合作，特别是国际间法学家的进一
I,
步合
at
作。
the moment, want to stress that international cooperation, particularly further cooperation among the international jurists, is needed.
而且上述
After
问
all,
题
the Earth is small, and even
也毕
toxins
竟是许多地
dropped
区
from the corner and may have a butterfly
我们说这个
effect
事情离自己很
on
遥
the
远呢，
entire world.
你不能说
Even
抗
if
击
the
维权
issue
专制
mentioned above may not be universal, at least to various degree, they are the issue many regions face. Who can confidently claim those issues are far away from them? Similarly, who can claim fighting an authoritarian dictatorship is responsibility of a politician alone?
现有的国际治理体系很难被认为已经处于理想状态，能够强有力的推动公平正义，引领文化遗产保护。
The
没错，
international
国际社会
government
确
system
实已经有
is
了人
far
权
from
公约、
ideal
文化权利公约
concerning
和文化多样性
vigorously promoting fairness
有了
and justice and leading
文化遗产
cultural
公约
heritage protection.
有了国际博物馆
The
协会
global
和国际
society already has Universal Declaration of Human
但
Rights,
就是在这些
International
公约
Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity,
依然在出
World
现
Heritage
在慢
Convention, the
我们可能需
Convention
要
for the
找到一种
Safeguarding
方法，
of the
建立
intangible
中国
cultural
内部
heritage.
做
We
出
also
独立
have International Council of
独
Museum,
立完善先
the
进规
World
则的建立。
Heritage Committee, and other organizations. However, they are not perfect. Still, many problems are emerging and spreading under the nose of those conventions and organizations. We arguably need to set up an independent mechanism to assess the effectiveness of our current work and working procedure concerning the culture heritage protection and to recommend appropriate step-by-step reform accordingly.
我们也可能需要向海牙公约的起草者学习。海牙公约是法学家思考 战争之惨烈后智慧
We
的
may
升华。
also need to draw
相对
insights
于
from the
王书
drafter of Hague
代表文化遗
Convention.
产的船员瓦
Hague
砾，我们
Convention
需要意识
is
到，缺乏
supplementation
公平正义原
of
则
the
的规范
wisdom
和
of the former
极端
truth
民族主义和威权专制
closely
统治
reflect
带
on
给
the
文化遗
tragedy
产
of the World War.
多样性的系
We
统
need to
屠杀，
learn from them,
攻
always
性
focus
完
on and
全
carefully
不
reflect on the
我
large-scale
们是否
problem
同样
that
需要一部
humanity
专
has
门的
ever
国际公
faced?
约，对
We need
禁止
to bear
防
in
止
mind,
并在执行
compare
之
with the damage
处罚
that
措施
armed
方面
conflict
认识
brought to the
新
cultural heritage.
和新的
In
态势。
absence of the principle of fairness and justice as norm or guidelines, the injury that extreme nationalism, authoritarianism could bring to the cultural heritage would be much worse. They would result in systematic forced removal of the diversity and the total loss of authenticity and integrity. And do we also need to set up special international convention, particularly preventing those damage? Would establish an effective enforcement mechanism and punitive measure require humankind to show the new wisdom and courage?
为接近上述目标，我们可以从许多具体事情做起，比如我们可以建立适当的平台或项目组，争取相关基金会的
To
支持，
approach above the goal,
发
we
表
can start
传
with
播
one
具体
specific
报
thing.
告和评论，
For
使
example,
更
we
多的
can
人意
establish
识到
a
对公共
corporate
的重要。
platform
当
or
然，找
project
寻到并始
seek
终采用
support
积极稳
from
妥可持续的方法
relevant
开展
fund or foundation,
非常重要
publish or distribute a series of report, commentary documents, so that more and more people can realize the importance of those goals. Of course, it's necessary to fund and always adopt a positive, stable, and sustainable way to carry out the above work.
民族主义分子和威权专制统治者的意识形态以摆弄过往为基础，他们必然试图掌控历史叙事，
Ideology of a
缔造
nationalist
需要的
and
文化遗产，
authoritarian rulers is
实
always
现可
based
持续发展
on
的必要
history
条件。
manipulated by them. They
在
always
发言的时候，我必须强
adapt
调这个。
to control the history narrative and create the cultural heritage which fit their needs. Their behaviors directly conflict with a necessary condition for achieving sustainable development. At the end of my presentation, I would like to stress this point.
谢谢大家，也再次感谢悉尼科技大学法学院田教授的帮助，谢谢。
Thank you, and thanks again for Professor Tian with help with translation.
Thank you, Dr. He. And I think people probably now appreciate why I felt it important to make the invitation to Dr. He. He has always been forthright, honest, and consistent, I must say, always, and speaks to his experiences for over 20 years in this field at the cutting edge. I know that my introduction to him was prior to the Olympic Games coming to his home city and the impact that it was having on his home city, particularly in relation to traditional housing and traditional neighbourhoods. So that we know, I suspect, much like what occurred in Sydney, that phenomenon just simply accelerated after the Olympics. And so much of what he talks about rings very true, not just in relation to monuments and sites, but also to the more ephemeral nature of our culture, that is the intangible aspects of it and the losses that relate to those cultural sites in relation to intangible heritage, which Lukas Lesinski, who Judge Charlesworth referred to, has written so eloquently about and is a scholar in that area as well. Unfortunately, our third speaker hasn't been able to join us, but that gives us a chance to have a more extended Q&A. So I do welcome or ask that participants please pop your questions in the Q&A function or in the chat, which I've enabled now. I know that people are probably itching to ask. Both of our panelists are available to questions that they may have on this topic. And I will also invite my colleague who has been kind enough to translate to continue to translate any interventions or any questions that may go to Mr. He or Dr. He. So I'll start the questions, if I may. Firstly, to Dr. He, as he's just finished, I was very intrigued by your suggestion of an additional instrument in this field. We know quite often the criticism has been that there are too many instruments in this area and too many treaties that have siloed the protection of cultural heritage. What kind of instrument would you suggest? What kind of treaty, given the difficulties that we have already with the enforcement of the ones that we have? And do you envisage it being something like the one that is with the Council of Europe, where it is a framework convention around access to justice and participatory rights? So what kind of convention do you see as necessary at the multilateral level to cure some of the shortcomings and the ills that you have warned us about?
何先生，刚才您提到了一个非常重要的建议，就是现在国际已经有很多国际条约，还有国际的机制在从事这方文化遗产保护方面。您刚才提出要建立一些更有效的新的机制，请问您可不可以将这些机制更具体化的解释一下？是不是要建立一些，比如像欧盟框架下的公平正义机制等等？
这是一个很长期的一个工作。那么在我看来
，I believe it's a very long-term project. Yeah.
在我看来，我们现在既缺乏一种基本的共识，那么在
now lack of some consensus. Yeah.
那么在国际公约这个层面，我们也缺乏像海牙公约针对武装冲突情况下保护文化遗产这样的一个国际条约，我们是缺乏的。那么其他的关于人权的公约，
For example, and in Hague Convention, maybe we need to include some content in relation to how to protect cultural heritage during the wartime. Yeah.
可能就像我刚才所说的，现在我们需要做的，可能要让更多的人知道这个方面存在的问题是极为具体、极为严重的。
I believe now the most important task for us, we should improve awareness of the public, particularly make public know the problem exists, is very serious, and we do need to pay attention to that, address them.
我现在想说的就是这些。
Oh, that's what I want to say right now. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. He. Judge Charlesworth, I'll address the next question to you, and it's something that's probably come to the fore in recent weeks, but it has been percolating along for many, many years, if not decades. You are now judge on the court. It's probably one of the only institutions, international institutions, which some would say has credibility. We know that with the many crises that the international community faces today, include the Security Council has been seen to be missing in action, as has UNESCO. We see the likelihood of the fact that the World Heritage Committee's meeting for the 50th anniversary will take place, unless something occurs in the interim, will take place in Kazan in Russia in a few weeks' time. What do you see as the role of the court? And I realise that may be sensitive for you, so I certainly don't wish to do that. But we know that the court has been, as courts, constitutional courts have been important at the national level of engaging difficult issues in societies. And now we're talking about the international community, the global society, in addressing these difficult issues. Do you see a role for the court in this field? And I know that you mentioned some important decision that the court has made in this area already.
Yeah, well, I think that I'm aware, and I guess as acutely since I've become a member of the court, that there are many hopes that are placed in the court, that in the sense the court can't address. Each day when I come into work in this beautiful Peace Palace building, The Hague, one often finds outside various protesters with banners for causes, really important causes, sort of raising questions of justice from all over the world. There'll be different ones often each day. And while I understand I think it's important that the court, you know, that its forecourt at least allows that space, I think that the court is in fact quite limited in what it can do. So for a start, the court can only deal with disputes that are brought to it in its contentious jurisdiction. It can't make a statement without a dispute. And in a sense, so if disputes are brought to the court that directly implicate these issues, my sense is that it's able to deal with them extremely well and in a very considered way. I must say I've been impressed by the tremendous work that goes into crafting all of the court's pronouncements. So everything is done with a lot of thought and reflection. Having said that, of course, the court also has a very interesting advisory jurisdiction. Typically the Security Council, the General Assembly, or other appropriately authorised UN bodies can request an advisory opinion on a particular issue from the court. And in fact, over the life of the court, it's given advisory opinions on a number of really significant questions: the legality of the Israeli barrier wall, the legality of nuclear weapons, issues as huge as the status of the Western Sahara, really implicating huge issues of justice. So there are those avenues. Having said that, the court, of course, has the issue of cultural heritage protection brought to it on one of its cases between sort of parallel cases between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where one of the issues in the case, not the main one, but one of the issues in the case has been an issue of protection of cultural heritage. And of course, I note also that the International Criminal Court, of course, has also dealt with, in a very important case, questions of whether destruction of cultural heritage can constitute a war crime. So that's there's quite a lot going on, in a sense, at the international level. But if I just say that I think of a case involving a question of cultural heritage can be brought to court, and if the court has jurisdiction, the court, of course, relies on the acceptance of its jurisdictions by states. That could be an important contribution if that case were to come. I'd be confident that the court would deal with it judiciously.
Thank you so much, Hilary. And one of the participants has corrected me, who clearly follows the World Heritage Committee's proceedings much more closely than I have, Michael Turner from Jerusalem, and I'm pleased that he has joined us, has said that the Kazan meeting has been postponed, which is, given the situation, is an important development. So we have a intervention or a question from one of our colleagues, Clementine Bourri. She asks, can we imagine a specific declaration providing a new interpretation of the principle of sustainability that includes cultural heritage together with environmental issues? What content would it have? Could it cover both, as she mentions, cultural and environmental sustainability in common? And how could we avoid an anthropocentric vision of nature? And I know that this is something that certainly has come to the fore in more recent times. Now, Hilary, I might put that to you, because I know that sorry, I shouldn't say that, I've lapsed into that. Judge Charlesworth, I know that a number of your colleagues at Melbourne University are engaged in this research, as well as our colleagues throughout the world and our region. Can we think of an instrument, and I'll then put it to Dr. Ha as well, an instrument which brings together the environmental and the cultural issues while trying to avoid this emphasis on the anthropocentric? Yeah.
对 Doctor 和问题是，我们是否可以想象建立这么一个很具体的宣言，一个条约，运用这个条约呢，为可持续性发展的原则提供更具体的阐释，包括文化遗产的定义以及环境问题等等。这些他们的具体的实质意义是什么？内容是什么？以及文化与环境的可持续发展之间有什么共同点？我们在制定这类的条约的时候，如何才能避免过分的以人类为中心的这样的一种方式进行？
这个文化这个概念
The concept of culture
太宽泛了。
is very wide. Yeah.
我们强调文化多样性，我们强调人类要保持好奇心，我们强调相互宽容。那么在这样的过程中间，往往
compromise, understand each other.
许多基本定义在被有意无意的改变。
And in such a process, many definition has been revised,
一个什么
intentionally
样的
or
好的机
unintentionally.
制、好的方法、好的机构能够确保人真的能够像人的尊严那样有尊严的生活，让这个社会朝着正当的方向去发展去。我觉得我们需要，有的时候人类可能太自信了，我们可能没有意识到里边有许许多多的羊肠小道。
We need to have an organization, make sure and we make our life simple and always on the right direction. And sometimes we didn't realize, and the life is the reality is much more complicated, and sometimes we miss the original direction, and in such kind of process.
我在过去的很多年里边有很多机会去接触不同的国家、不同领域的这些个专家或者官员，有的时候我会发现很多人很傲慢，或者说很
over
自
the
信。
past decades, and I got the opportunity to meet with the official from different countries and in different areas. But sometimes I found some officials, officers, and a bit arrogant and don't listen from others.
那么实际上面，有的时候我会发现，不同的人在用同样的概念、同样的词说着不同的话。
In fact, sometimes I realize, and when the people use the same terminology, actually they try to express completely different things. Yeah.
在许多场合，鸡同鸭的对话是普遍存在的。
In many occasions, and the people they using sometimes they use the same terminology, but they don't really understand each other. Just like the different type of animals speak to each other.
所以我们需要一个方法，能够让一些不同地区的人能够坐在一起，对现在已经有的这些公约、这些文件，包括文化遗产保护的，包括可持续发展的这些对里边的这些概念、这些表述，我们进行一个反思，我们是不是不同的人对这些东西的理解是不是一样的？
So
在我看来，这是很重要的。
In that case, I think one very important thing is how can we create opportunity, make sure the people experts from different countries see together, we communicate with each other, particularly dealing with the basic concept already articulated and in the all different type of cultural heritage convention. And let's make sure and see whether we truly have the common understanding about the basic definition and concept in all this international treaty. I do believe such kind of communication is really important.
大概就是这些。
Yeah, that's my view. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm conscious of the time. We have a couple questions which I'll put to the panel before we wrap things up. So the first one is to Judge Charlesworth. The reference you made was to ongoing dialogue between various levels of legal administration. The question relates to how can the ICJ get reliable insights about the functioning of the rule of law on the ground and what is happening, the reality of what is happening on the ground. I suspect I might know what that answer will be, Hilary, but I'll Judge Charlesworth, but I'll let you, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks for the questions. And can I just briefly reflect on Clementine's earlier question about imagining such a declaration? That made me want to say that in what I've painted, I fear, sort of a rather bleak picture of international law here. I also, your great question just reminds me to emphasize that the important role of civil society. So, of course, a lot of international law is created, the big players in international law tend to be states. They're, for example, coming to this court, the International Court of Justice, it's only got jurisdiction over states, not over individuals, and no non-government organisation can just come along to the court and say, we'd like to bring a case. Having said that, I'd acknowledge much more generally in international law the critical role that strategic intervention by civil society has played in a great number of areas, and often in other fields, in coming up with declarations and so on. Of course, sometimes it's great if you can have them adopted by the United Nations, but I can think in a number of fields, particularly in human rights, particularly, for example, with respect to violence against women, areas where civil society have come up with important declarations, had them adopted, or tried to bring them to the attention of intergovernmental organisations. So it's just to say, I think it's really important for civil society to feel that they do have a place. And of course, civil society is likely to be less free from they're freer from diplomatic shackles and can often come up with much broader thinking about issues. So the type of declaration that you were sketching there, it struck me, yes, this could be a really important issue. While it's also clear in the development of international law more broadly, not just in this court, that the activities of civil society and statements of non-government organisations can have legal impact, and they certainly sort of come part of the fabric of regulation of particular problems. But that perhaps is a good point to lead into the second very thoughtful question about how, sitting here in this beautiful old building, but with a very big fence all around it and very tight security, how does the court itself get any sense of what's going on the ground? Again, as I've said, unless there's an advisory opinion request, the court is dealing with state parties. Now, depending on the subject matter, it may well be, and there are some cases on the court's docket currently where the views, important evidence about what's going on in the ground are brought to the court by states. And you can perhaps look at the court's docket to be able to work out which cases those might be. I also note there have been some very profound and important occasions, not that I've witnessed them directly, but I've seen them online, footage. This is in the case of advisory opinions, when the court gives advisory opinions, where all members of the UN can intervene and make submissions to the court. I'm thinking of the court's most recent advisory opinion on the status of the Chagos archipelago. Mauritius had people speaking, Chagosians, actually coming to the court and speaking to the court about their experience. And this also happened in the case of the legality of nuclear weapons, when the mayor of Hiroshima came and directly testified at the court. And they're just astonishing occasions when the court in this grand hall of justice are hearing from people directly on the ground. So it's not very common. It depends on the states parties bringing the cases, but there have been these very profound moments. But having said that, of course, given our internet age, it's often one's very aware in the sort of circumstances surrounding a particular case of local views as well. But one does rely on the parties to actually bring that evidence before the court.
Thank you, David Ritchie-Lowe, for allowing Judge Charlesworth. I'm still getting used to it. I'm still getting used to it. But it's a wonderful honour, and we're so glad that you have been elevated to allow Judge Charlesworth that opportunity for that very thoughtful intervention, a really important one. The final question is from another Australian, this time from Brisbane. I think, Ian, you are in Brisbane, Ian Lilly. He asks to both panellists that last year the culture ministers of the G20 unanimously adopted the Rome Declaration of the culture ministers, focusing on culture, including cultural heritage and sustainable growth. So while that has been now overshadowed with what's happening in the Ukraine and with the G20 meeting in Indonesia, do you think that this organisation, the G20, could be active in advancing an appropriate approach to heritage protection, especially during conflicts and post-conflict? And we know, and I should mention for participants, for those that are not aware, that a number of the instruments that we've referred to, particularly the declarations coming out of the General Assembly, have been very broad-ranging and have referred to the importance of peace building, which Judge Charlesworth, in a former life, has written quite extensively on. So can we see a role for the G20 in this field when it's now advancing this idea of cultural heritage and sustainable growth, particularly in conflict and post-conflict situations? I'll pass to Dr. He and then Judge Charlesworth for the last word. Dr. He?
Just 刚才有听众Ian Lilly问了这样一个问题：尊敬的小组成员们，去年底G20文化部长会议上一致通过了文化部长罗马宣言，重点关注文化，包括文化遗产和可持续发展。尽管今年在印度尼西亚举行的 G20 的会议上，乌克兰局势使这个会议蒙上了阴影，但您认为像 G20 这样的组织能否有效的推进建立适当的新的文化遗产保护的方法，尤其是在冲突局势之后？
我没有资格批评任何人，我也没有资格去批评任何这样有力量的机构。
I'm not able to qualify to criticize anyone or any powerful institute.
但是呢，我总是希望这些机构的人，这些部长们能够在讲出他们在念他们的发言稿的时候，能够真的也是这么想的。
I always think when those ministers, when they read out their speech and in those international conference, what they said is what they thought.
而且我总是希望这些人能够更加诚恳，更加善良。
I hope they can show more good faith and be more honest to the public.
坦率的说，如果说像这样的机构对他的评价能够达到100分的话，那么我们现在存在的许多问题就不存在了。
If we can give 100%, 100 mark and full mark for all these international institute, then all the problems we discussed today will not exist at all.
大概就是想说这些。
Yeah, that's my view. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. He. Judge Charlesworth?
Yeah, thanks very much for the question. I must say I wasn't aware of that declaration, Ian, that you've pointed to, and I'll make sure that I look that up. I just say, on one level, yes, of course, it's important to get every international grouping considering the issue. It seems to me that's a really important one, and I think Dr. He's very moving account of his work in China just reminds us of the sort of the intricacies of the problem and the easiness with which perhaps international standards, the language of international standards, can clash with human rights. So there's this sort of constant tension. Of course, the G20, and I know Australia's part of it, my observation, I'm not an expert on it, tends to have a focus. I mean, they're grouped together from an economic perspective. And it's striking that sometimes work done in essentially an economic organisation will perhaps give priority to economic questions, whereas I think the force of Dr. He's presentation very much is to bring to the fore questions of human rights. So it may well be that the declaration that you refer to has done that, but there is one of the only problems if every group is adopting statements on this is that getting inconsistency between the different international standards. And I think it's important to, for example, going back to the UNESCO, the 2015 statement, one would want to check that these later statements give the same priority to equality and to human rights, for example, that UNESCO has really emphasised in the 2015 statement. But yes, that would be my response to your interesting question.
Thank you, Judge Charlesworth. A final comment is from my colleague in the Four Universities Consortium, Sophie Vigneron, from Kent University, to thank both panellists. And I know, and it is a shame that our colleague from SUVA was not able to come into this panel to give the Pacific perspective, which is so important on this topic, but hopefully in another forum that will happen. So I take this opportunity now to thank all panellists, Her Excellency Judge Charlesworth and Dr. He, for this timely and broad-ranging discussion of our themes today: the significance of culture and international cooperation in the pursuit of a sustainable future, and UNESCO's objectives of furthering universal respect for justice, rule of law, and human rights and fundamental freedoms. The importance of and the urgency of these issues has been made clear by our discussions and this webinar, and also throughout the webinar series. The link to this video recording will be provided to all attendees in the coming days. So thank you to all for joining us this morning in Europe and this evening in Asia and the Pacific. And also to colleagues around the world. So thank you very, very much.